Chapter 14. Now that Anna had become an unofficial team member, her role changed radically. She sat crouched at the base of the rocks just beyond the encampment, scanning the tree line with binoculars. Mac manoeuvred by her, uncoiling a new tripwire linking 4 claymore mines, camouflaged by leaves and branches, at strategic points around the camp. In a tree at the edge of the clearing, Billy tossed a roll of wire to Ramirez, who wound it around a grenade wedged in the crotch of a cottonwood's branches. When they'd finished, every inch of ground surrounding the camp, to a radius of 30 meters, was booby-trapped, all except for a single narrow corridor for getting out and down the canyon trail. At the end of the path, where the rock outcropping merged with the jungle, Schaefer hauled down a vine about 4 inches in diameter, straining with every ounce of strength, biceps bulging and glistening with sweat. On the other side of the path, Dylan took up the slack of the vine around the base of a rubber tree. Like a fisherman at his nets, the Major took the free end of the vine and attached it to a 40-foot sapling, arcing the sapling closer to the ground with every pull, till it formed a gigantic bow, creaking and groaning with tension. With a final mighty heave, the Major drew the sapling enough within reach to grip the top branches, then gestured to Dylan to tie it off. Dylan assisted with some reluctance. He knew that if he didn't cooperate, he'd be about as welcome here as at a KKK meeting. But the part of him that needed to be in charge couldn't refrain from ragging Schaefer, whom he saw as usurping his authority steadily, inch by inch. Effectively, this was so, but Schaefer didn't see it that way. He was just trying to get a job done, and though the job required a commando's skills, it had nothing to do with soldiering anymore, and so was beyond the need of a chain of command. In some ways now, it was every man for himself. "I'm telling you, we're wasting what little time we've got left," Dylan argued truculently. "This snare shit ain't gonna stop the guerrillas. All we're doing is letting the rest of them catch up with us." Schaefer had long ago learned when to turn off his attention, and thus ignored Dylan entirely. The Major continued to secure the vine, then dragged a net into position, crudely woven of rubber branches, leaves still attached. Methodically, he began to cover the net with more leaves and debris. Just maybe they could catch a monster in the same ancient way the Mayans caught their sacred jaguars. Dutch moved swiftly, picking up a framework of whittled sticks he had tied together as a crude spring trigger. He held up the makeshift contraption, hurriedly examining his work for flaws before fixing it in place at the edge of the net. "He'll be looking for tripwires. If we're lucky, he won't see this," he explained absently to Dylan. "What's this he shit?" countered the black man. "You sound like we're waiting for one guy. There's an army out there, Major." "Can it, Dylan? The bastard who's after us now is no pinko contra. It ain't that simple anymore. Look, I'm heading back to the others. You coming, or you want to stay here like a sitting duck?" Dylan followed, sullenly, as the Major walked away, but he couldn't bear not to get in a last dig. "Now what, Dutch? You gonna send your mystery guest an invitation?" Schaefer stopped and swiveled around, staring at the black man. "Now you're catching on, smartass. Maybe we're gonna save your little dick after all." Schaefer laughed gruffly and turned away again, completely discarding any further notion of rank and protocol. To him, Dylan was just another pain in the butt now. The sticky morning passed excruciatingly slow, and a humid tropical fog loomed as heavy as the tedious minutes. By noon, the sun had crept through, white and exhausted, and the visibility gradually returned. Half an hour later, the pulsing rays glistened on the beads of sweat that coated every leaf, every mossy surface. The jungle danced, as usual. Swarms of bees in the orchids, swoops of hungry birds, hyenas lurking patiently in the shadows, waiting for a gorged jaguar to leave a tapir lunch behind. The commandos sat stoically silent, heavily camouflaged with leaves twisted about their caps, huddled in the twisted brambles of their camp. They waited, motionless as statues, fixated on the twisting vegetation growing rampant on the canyon rim around them. They'd done all they could to prepare for the aliens' next attack, using every glimmer of initiative they could think of for defense, turning to the jungle itself for help, as with the vine snare braced to snap if an intruder so much as breathed on its trigger. But so far the only sounds were the normal lulling hum and buzz of the jungle, seemingly unchanged for 1,000 years. Then all at once, between 1 minute and the next, a veil of silence descended over the jagged highlands of the interior. The Major couldn't tolerate the waiting any longer, and he stirred like a cougar cornered in its lair. He nodded to Ramirez, indicating that he was moving out to check the trap. Slowly he stood, his senses burning, the silence growing louder in his head like an inner scream. He walked carefully along the narrow leaf-shrouded corridor while the others sighted down their hidden gun barrels, covering Schaefer from 3 angles, all the while scanning the canyon for the slightest hint of sound or movement. As the Major reached the primitive trap, meticulously skirting the various triggers that could snap him off his feet in a flash, he stopped and waited, sweat pouring down his face and neck, drenching his already clinging shirt. A green snake slithered near his feet, and he flinched slightly, but couldn't afford to lose his focus on the vastness around him. Something was nearby, hiding and waiting. He could practically feel it breathe. His fingers tightened on the trigger of his M202. Quickly, he spun around to glance behind, then he came around again full circle and waved his gun from left to right. Nothing. Not a hint. Yet the continuing silence tipped him off that something dangerous was out there. Finally, he turned back to the camp, his taut face registering a kind of disappointment that he hadn't encountered the enemy. A face-to-face would surely be better than all this elusiveness. He marched briskly towards the others, feeling hollow and defeated. It was Billy he went to first, hoping now for some sign from the magic world he so resisted. But as he approached, the Indian shook his head in grim bewilderment. Dylan rose and strode over to the two of them. He had an "I told you so" smirk written across his face. "Satisfied?" he demanded sarcastically. "Now, can we get the hell out of here?" Just then, from the end of the corridor by the snare, a loud swish, followed by the snapping of branches, broke the silence. An instant later, the net exploded off the jungle floor in a hail of leaves and sticks, rocketing up into a stand of mahogany trees growing tightly together. Schaefer jerked his head around, and the whole team leaped to its feet as the trap went off. Even at this distance, they could see that a huge, struggling creature mauled the sides of the net, and a long, unearthly, high-pitched screech echoed through the canyon. Schaefer led the commandos down the short incline along the corridor towards the bobbing net. All their guns were cocked. Only Anna remained behind, crouching behind a rocky outcropping, terrified and praying. As they arrived under the net, it was beginning to tear beneath the strain of its victim's powerful thrusts. Then the whole network of branches exploded into smithereens of vine and leaves and dirt. A streak of pulsating crimson leaped for the trees, and a powerful 3-fingered hand gripped at a limb. It was the alien, at the height of day, raging scarlet and mercurial beneath the brilliant sun, without any camouflage at all. As the men watched, appalled and mesmerized, the creature shook off the last traces of vegetation. With its free arm, it pulled its weapon out of nowhere, the sharp spearhead gleaming in the sunlight. Its mouth roared with fury, and with one sweep, it slashed angrily at a limb 8 inches thick, severing the heavy wood and sending it plummeting to the ground. Ramirez didn't see the severed limb in time, and it struck him with a thudding blow to the shoulder, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backwards into the underbrush. When he landed, his shirt was torn from belly to shoulder, exposing a deep gouge in his chest that erupted with spurts of black-red blood. Then, with an easy leap, the alien dropped to a lower branch 15 feet from the ground, just above the soldiers' heads. They watched in frozen horror. Meanwhile, some kind of instinct took over Anna as soon as she saw Ramirez fall, and she ran down the hill to his aid. The alien's physical presence had shocked her back to reality, and the reality she was struck by told her that the commandos were her only hope. The more of the team that remained alive, the better all their odds would be. The stunned commandos gaped at the creature, momentarily paralyzed as they confronted it for the first time, naked and in its humanoid form, close enough to touch. Its lizard skin was pulsating deep vermilion now, in high contrast to the lush green of the surroundings. It clung to the side of the tree like a terrible, hellish gargoyle, snarling and hissing like a siren, full of enormous hate. Dylan, more dumbfounded than the rest because he'd been so stubbornly resistant to all the signs, was the first to speak. "What in God's name?" he whispered. As the black man spoke, the alien let loose with a loud, penetrating trill, its wide red mouth agape, revealing saw-toothed fangs. A moment later, its colour modulated and swirled with blues and greens until the creature seemed to bleed into the leaves, invisible again. Mac opened fire on the disappearing form, shredding the limb and leaves it clutched. But it was already too late. The alien was gone. Fevered and wild, Mac raved madly into the jungle after it. Schaefer bellowed, "Mac! Mac! Come back! You don't know where the hell it went!" The Major snapped the empty magazine from his rifle and inserted a new one while barking an order to Billy. "Get Ramirez and the girl and get out of here! Now!" Then he started off through the trees after Mac. But immediately, Dylan stepped in his path, a hand pushing against Schaefer's chest. "No way, Dutch! I'm going! You take the rest and get the hell over the border!" "This is no time to play hero, Dylan," Schaefer retorted, surprised at the black man's toughness. "Guess I've picked up some bad habits from you, Dutch," Dylan replied. "Now don't argue with me. Not only am I your commanding officer, but you also know I'm right. Get to that chopper and hold it for us. I'll find Mac and we'll be right behind you. Dylan, you can't win this one." The Major was almost touched by Dylan's sincerity. There was a glimmer here of the man he would have laid down his life for, once. The black soldier stared back defiantly. He was beginning to show the stripes he wore. "You know me, Dutch. I never did know when to quit. Besides, how am I ever going to be the first black president if I don't learn to walk through the fire?" For the first time on this mission, Schaefer felt a rush of feeling for the old Dylan. The Major backed down now, with more than a touch of respect for the man. It was a strange experience for a loner like Schaefer to find himself proud to obey the man who was supposed to be in charge all along. As Dylan moved out, Schaefer called after him, "Hey buddy, take this." As the top man turned back, Schaefer tossed him a spare MP5. Dylan snatched it out of the air with one hand. They shared an utterly naked look, a look that said their differences were settled. It was also a look of farewell. These were men who kept their bases covered. "I'll see you at the chopper," Schaefer said, with a dreadful hollow certainty that he would never see the man alive again. "Right behind you," Dylan called back. The black man had truly left his desk behind as he hefted both weapons at the hip and trotted off into the jungle after Mac. Schaefer watched him go for a moment, then turned back to Ramirez, who was now sitting up with Anna and Billy's help. He was holding his ribs and gasping for breath. "He's busted up pretty bad, Major," Billy reported. "Fuck you, Tonto," the wiry Chicano snarled while wheezing for air. "I can make it. Help me up." And he held a hand out to his brother Scout. Schaefer walked over and gripped an arm around Ramirez for support. "Come on, Poncho," he said. "We're getting out of here. Billy, take the radio and leave the rest of the stuff. Let's move!" As the foursome limped along the canyon rim, looking for a downhill trail that would feed them out of the border, Mac was a quarter-mile away, creeping low to the ground, his eyes searching the trees. "Come on, you motherfucker," he whispered urgently. About 300 yards back, behind Mac, Dylan was tracking through the underbrush, straining to zero in on a faint rustling in the foliage up ahead. Was it Mac? At first the sound was too vague and sporadic to identify. The black man froze, listening harder, and began to make out a barely audible voice. "Dylan, over here." The words came whispering through the trees, Cautiously, the commander of the mission moved ever closer to the sound, parting the leaves like curtains, then heard the voice again.
"Dylan, psst, over here."
And the black man ducked through a tangle of vines and entered a small dark clearing, almost claustrophobic with the density of the highland foliage on every side, gripping the jagged canyon stone. Dylan looked around a full 360 degrees, but saw nothing except the endless wall of jungle.
"Mac,"
Dylan whispered, in no particular direction. Just as he spoke, a hand darted out of the brush and covered the commander's mouth. He choked with terror as Mac pulled him into his hiding place in a rift between chunks of canyon granite.
"It's out there."
Mac pointed breathlessly.
"Behind that rock. Can you see it?"
Dylan strained his eyes as if to will them to see clearer and deeper. After a long moment, he thought he saw a slight movement where Mac had gestured.
"I think I got a glimpse,"
Dylan whispered back.
"Let's take him out, huh?"
he added impatiently. Then he hastily outlined a simple attack plan to his fellow commando, who for the first time found himself in agreement with this slick-edged soldier he thought had gone soft. Dylan jabbed a finger towards a rock outcropping strangled by masses of creeper vines about 100 feet away.
"Take a cover position over there. I'll work around towards you. When I flush him out, you nail him."
"Gotcha," Mac agreed without an instant's hesitation.
"Listen, I got a score to settle for the bro."
"We've both got scores to settle," Dylan corrected him. It was as if Dylan had done some hard reflecting on his own role in this mission so far, and he wasn't pleased at all with the deceit. True, it had been thought necessary for the highest national security purposes, but finally, so what? It had also been the source of the tension between Schaefer, the team, and himself. Somehow he wanted to make up for all the crossed feelings, and he knew that wiping out the mutant creature was the one way to do it. Silently, Dylan disappeared into the jungle. Mac watched him vanish among the vine-locked boulders, then made his own way towards the target, working round the razor-sharp rocks and heaving himself through the masses of vines. It was a brief distance, but a rugged journey, trying to move quietly and invisibly through the knotted confusion of the high jungle. The place seemed more primeval, less touched by man, than any ground they trod so far. It was the site of some vast Darwinian nakedness, pre-human and without remorse. Mac cursed himself as a branch snapped back in his face or a vine grasped at his leg. But finally he made it to the rocky spur, settled into position, and scanned the jungle below. He could see Dylan moving off to his left, several meters away, his face intense and determined. Vague, unidentifiable sounds echoed through the clotted canyon forest as Mac pulled himself forward. Then he caught a fleeting image of movement in the foliage ahead. He began to sweat bullets as recollections of the hideous blood-red creature crowded into his mind. Was it out there waiting? He recalled the row of dead men hanging gutted, their insides spilled and their faces twisted in anguish. He forced the thought from his mind, switched the safety catch off his rifle, and reached up for another vine to pull himself even higher. He felt a queer warm movement beneath his grip. He didn't even have time to react as the vine began to crawl around his fingers. A second later, he was horrified to see the sinewy green bark change even as he gripped it, till he was suddenly holding the claw-like hand of the alien. It ripped loose from Mac's grip, flipped around in a swirl of flashing prehensile fingers, and grabbed the commando by the wrist. The stunned soldier looked up in time to see the creature's two burning yellow eyes piercing down at him like burning liquid starlight. Just as its other hand swooped to his throat, its razor-sharp spur slashing through his windpipe. Mac pitched forward, instantly dead, and landed with a thud in a scatter of mouldering leaves. His heart, still pumping, gushed out spurts of blood from his severed jugular. It was all done quietly, smoothly, quickly, and life ran away in a meaningless ooze, to be swallowed up by the famished jungle floor.